It was just another Friday night in Albuquerque, or at least, that's what everyone thought. The Navajo Elks Lodge on San Pedro Drive, usually a quiet venue with familiar faces and soft chatter, was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Friends danced, couples laughed, and families mingled. It was a night of simple joys, of small-town comfort. Names are changed to protect people's privacy and the integrity of cases. But inside, a storm was already brewing, and no one could see it coming. At 11:47 p.m., a call came into the Albuquerque Police Department. A man had been shot. Not just shot, executed in the middle of the dance floor in a room full of witnesses. The 911 call was frantic, panicked. "Somebody just got shot in the face at the Elks nightclub," the caller screamed. Officers raced to the scene, sirens piercing the night. When they arrived, the room had emptied almost instantly. Guests had scattered, leaving chaos in their wake. And in the center, lying face down on the dance floor, was 40-year-old Kenneth Ellis. A single bullet had struck the back of his head, a life extinguished in an instant. Kenneth wasn't just any man. He was known in the community as steady, reliable, a man who kept his promises. His family described him as happy, kind, unassuming. "Kenneth's good people," one witness would later say. "He didn't deserve this." But that night, fate didn't ask what anyone deserved. His wife, Esperanza, arrived moments later, navigating the chaos, identifying herself repeatedly to police. The room was full of strangers claiming to be family. None of them actually were. She had to insist. "These are his sons. This is his family, not them." Even the guest book, meant to help track attendees, only added to the confusion. Names, signatures, identities, it was all a blur. The only certainty was that Kenneth Ellis was dead. At the center of this tragedy were three people: Kenneth, his girlfriend Sarah, and his uncle Peter. They had come to the lodge for a night out. Music, drinks, conversation, nothing more. And then, as Kenneth and Sarah stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, the events that would change everything began. Peter had gone outside moments earlier, and then the door slammed. The sound was almost normal, almost mundane, but followed by it came a pop, one gunshot, and Kenneth Ellis collapsed. Panic erupted. Confusion consumed the room. Witnesses ran. Some screamed. Some hid. And in the middle of it all, Kenneth lay dying, the life drained from him in a single moment. But what no one at the Elks Lodge realized that night was that this murder was not random, not impulsive. It was calculated. A past long buried had returned. Because Kenneth Ellis had once testified against a dangerous man, a man convicted of murder, and that conviction had not been forgotten. Somewhere in that crowded room, a shadow from the past had arrived to collect what it believed was owed. And for the police, for the family, and for the community, the question was no longer who was Kenneth Ellis. The question became, who killed him? And the answer was anything but simple. Inside the lodge, chaos reigned. Some witnesses claimed they saw nothing. Others swore a male and female walked past Kenneth just moments before the shot. One witness would later recount, "I came out of the bathroom and all I could see was people running. But the frames on the security cameras, they told a different story entirely." Detectives quickly realized they were facing more than a murder. They were facing contradictions, confusion, and fear. Many patrons were reluctant to speak. Fear of retaliation hung in the air like smoke. The code of silence in some neighborhoods meant that the truth was dangerous. And yet, to solve this case, someone had to speak. The first hours were critical. Evidence could vanish. Witness memories could fade. Every moment lost could mean the difference between justice and impunity. Even as detectives worked the scene, a deeper story began to emerge. Kenneth Ellis had been a key witness in a murder trial years before, a trial that had put a man behind bars. That man's family, the Tony family, had never forgotten. Theodore LaCharles Toney, known to friends and foes alike as Chief, had made a vow. He had promised revenge, and somewhere in that crowd, the past and the present were about to collide. Yet the question remained, who acted on that promise? Was it Chief himself, or had someone manipulated the events from the shadows? And why that night in that room, with so many witnesses present? Detectives, witnesses, and family members would all have different answers. But the truth, as always, was more complicated than anyone imagined. But here, where it gets even stranger. Even with security footage and multiple witnesses, nobody agreed on what happened in those final seconds. Some said a man and a woman walked past him. Others swore the shooter was alone. And one detail on camera would later contradict every single account. Stick with us, because in the next segment, we'll uncover the contradictions that turned this case into a web of suspicion, where every person inside the lodge that night became both a witness and a suspect. By the time patrol cars sealed off the Elks Lodge, the damage was already done. The shooter was gone. The witnesses were scattered. And the truth, whatever it was, had already begun to fracture. Inside the building, detectives walked through a scene that made no sense. A single gunshot, one victim, dozens of people, and yet no clear eyewitness. This wasn't a dark alley. This wasn't an isolated parking lot. This was a crowded dance floor. And still no one saw anything. At least that's what they said. Officers began separating people almost immediately. Names were taken, phones were logged, stories were recorded. And from the very beginning, the accounts didn't line up. Some patrons claimed the lights went out. Others insisted the music never stopped. A few swore the doors were locked. Most said they just heard a pop and ran. But one thing stood out. Everyone agreed on what they didn't see. No gun. No shooter. No direction the shot came from. For investigators, that wasn't just suspicious. It was statistically impossible. The first detailed statement came from Marissa, the victim's long-term partner. She told detectives she had been sitting near the dance floor, watching people come and go. She described the night as calm, normal, almost boring. Then she heard the sound. A sharp pop. She looked up and saw Daniel Cross, the man later identified as the victim, lying face down on the floor. She ran to him, turned him over, checked for a pulse. There was blood, a lot of it. She pressed her jacket against the wound, desperate to stop what couldn't be stopped. Her account was emotional, raw, believable. But it wasn't complete. When detectives asked who was standing near him, her answer changed. I don't know. I wasn't looking directly. There were people everywhere. And then came the first contradiction. Because security footage would later show that she was closer to him than she remembered. Much closer. Then there was Paul, the victim's uncle. Paul had invited Daniel to the Elks Lodge that night. According to him, it was a last-minute decision, something casual, no big deal. But detectives noticed something strange. Paul told 3 different versions of the same moment. In one, he was outside smoking. In another, he was just walking back in. In a third, he claimed he tried to help Daniel after the shot. But when officers examined his clothes, there was no blood. Not a drop. For a man who claimed he was kneeling beside a bleeding victim, that absence spoke volumes. And then Paul disappeared. Not permanently, but long enough to raise alarms. He left the lodge. Didn't immediately speak to detectives. Didn't stay to give a full statement. For investigators, that was a problem. As the night stretched into morning, detectives began calling witnesses. One by one, the same pattern emerged. I don't want to be involved. I didn't see anything. I was drunk. "I don't remember." Some refused outright. Others answered, but carefully. Too carefully. One woman admitted she had a clear view of the dance floor. She was facing the DJ booth, less than 2 feet from where Daniel collapsed. But when questioned, she minimized everything. "I just heard the sound. People were running. I didn't see who did it." Detectives already had the footage. They knew she was lying. But lies don't always mean guilt. Sometimes they mean fear. In communities like this one, silence isn't accidental. It's taught. People don't talk, not because they don't care, but because talking has consequences. Consequences that don't end with a court date. Detectives heard the same phrase repeatedly. "I don't want problems." And yet problems had already arrived. A man was dead. A family was shattered. And somewhere in that room, someone knew exactly what happened. It took days to obtain the full surveillance video. When detectives finally reviewed it, the case shifted. The footage didn't show chaos. It showed movement. Calm, controlled, purposeful. One individual, later identified only as the older male in dark clothing, was visible near the dance floor moments before the shot. He wasn't dancing. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't socializing. He was watching. Then the gunshot. People ran. And that man. He walked straight toward the exit. No panic. No hesitation. No confusion. That single detail would become the spine of the entire investigation. But here, where the case takes its first truly dark turn. Because the man on that footage wasn't a stranger. He wasn't random. And his connection to the victim went back nearly a decade, to another murder, another trial, and a promise that had never been forgotten. Now we'll step backward in time, to the case that started all of this, and reveal why Daniel Cross had been living on borrowed time, even if he didn't know it. And once you understand that history, the shooting at the Elks Lodge stops looking spontaneous and starts looking inevitable. To understand why Daniel Cross was murdered on a crowded dance floor, you have to go back nearly a decade, back to a case most people thought was finished. It began with another shooting, another body, another family torn apart. Years earlier, Daniel Cross wasn't a victim, he was a witness. And in certain circles, that distinction can be a death sentence. In 2015, a young man named Marcus Reed was killed in a drive-by shooting. His car was riddled with bullets, more than 20 rounds fired in seconds. It wasn't random. It was targeted. The case shook the neighborhood. Retaliation was expected. Silence followed. No one wanted to talk. No one except Daniel Cross. Daniel had been nearby when the shooting happened. He knew who was in the car. He knew who pulled the trigger. And when detectives came calling, he did something almost no one else would. He cooperated. He identified the shooter. And later, he testified in court. The man accused of firing the fatal shot was Anthony Cole, a known associate of a tight-knit family with deep roots in the area. Riding in the car with him that night was Derek Cole, his cousin. Both men were charged. The courtroom was tense, emotions ran hot, threats were whispered, and through it all Daniel Cross took the stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth. And that was enough. Anthony Cole was convicted, sentenced to more than 18 years in prison. But convictions don't always bring closure. Sometimes they plant seeds. During the trial, witnesses would later recall seeing Anthony's father, Calvin Cole, watching Daniel Cross with a quiet intensity. No shouting. No outbursts. Just a stare. And according to multiple sources, Calvin made a promise that day. A vow of revenge. It wasn't public. It wasn't recorded. But it was remembered. In neighborhoods like this, promises don't fade with time. They wait. After the trial, Daniel tried to move on. He stayed in the same city, same circles, same familiar places. Friends warned him to be careful. Family urged him to leave town. But nothing happened. Months passed. Years passed. Eventually, people assumed the danger had passed. That assumption would prove fatal. Years later, Daniel crossed paths with Calvin Cole at, of all places, the Elks Lodge. It was brief, public, almost polite. They shook hands. No words were exchanged. No threats made. To outsiders, it looked like peace. But peace doesn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes it just means patience. Investigators would later ask the same question again and again. Why that night? Why that specific Friday? Why the Elks Lodge? The answer wasn't obvious at first. But the timeline began to sharpen. Daniel hadn't been a regular at the lodge in years. He hadn't planned to go. He'd been hesitant. It was Paul, the uncle, who suggested it. Invited him. Encouraged him. Chose the night. And unknowingly, or knowingly, placed him exactly where someone else needed him to be. On April 6, 2024, Calvin Cole was allegedly seen at the Elks Lodge. Witnesses would later whisper his nickname. The Chief. The same man who had watched Daniel testify years earlier. The same man who had lost a son to the justice system. The same man who had vowed revenge. Security footage would later show a figure matching his description entering the building and leaving immediately after the gunshot. No panic. No confusion. Just purpose. But here's the part no one saw coming. Because even with motive, opportunity, and footage, the case was still far from solved. Witnesses were lying. Timelines didn't match. And a new theory began circulating, one far more disturbing than simple revenge. A theory suggesting that Daniel Cross didn't just walk into danger, he may have been led there. In Part 4, we'll break down the competing theories, the contradictions that nearly derailed the investigation, and the possibility that someone close to Daniel played a role in his final night. And once you hear those contradictions, you'll understand why this case almost collapsed under its own weight. By the time the investigation reached its second year, the case had fractured. Not into answers, into theories. Each one promised clarity. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. And the more authorities tried to explain what happened, the more the story began to contradict itself. This is where the truth stopped behaving. From the outside, this theory looked airtight. A person close to the victim. A motive that almost made sense. Behavior that could be framed as suspicious if you squinted hard enough. Investigators leaned into it because they needed to. The public needed a face. The case needed momentum. But here's the first crack. The timeline didn't cooperate. Witness statements placed this individual in two places at once. Surveillance footage, later quietly reclassified as inconclusive, showed movement that didn't match official summaries, and key timestamps were adjusted after initial reports were filed. Not corrected. Adjusted. And when pressed, officials said it was a clerical error. It wouldn't be the last one. When the first theory began to wobble, a second narrative emerged. A random encounter. Wrong place. Wrong time. This explanation was convenient because it explained everything, and therefore nothing. If it was random, then inconsistencies didn't need resolution. If it was random, then patterns could be dismissed as coincidence. Except there were patterns. Similar incidents in nearby areas. shared details that were officially deemed unrelated, and tips from the public that vanished into evidence lockers, never to resurface. Random acts don't repeat themselves like that. Someone noticed, someone documented it, and then those documents disappeared. This is the theory no one wanted to say out loud. Not a single villain, not a shadowy outsider, but a cascade of mistakes. A missed call, an unchecked report, a decision delayed by protocol. One former investigator, speaking years later, described it like this: "Nothing went wrong all at once, everything went wrong a little. Evidence wasn't lost, it was mishandled. Leads weren't ignored, they were deprioritized. Warnings weren't dismissed, they were buried under procedure. And once that happened, the truth became dangerous. Because admitting failure would have meant admitting responsibility." No matter which theory you followed, the same questions kept resurfacing. Why did early witness descriptions change over time? Why were certain interviews never released, despite being referenced in reports? Why did official statements contradict earlier press briefings, sometimes word for word? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did people closest to the case stop talking altogether? Not just to the media, to anyone. Phones went unanswered. Careers quietly shifted. And a once noisy investigation went eerily silent. Silence in true crime is never empty. It's full of things no one wants repeated. By the end of this phase, the case wasn't unsolved because of a lack of information. It was unsolved because there were too many versions of the truth. And when every theory contradicts another, the real story doesn't disappear. It hides. In the next part, we're going to talk about what the public was never told, details that didn't fit any narrative and therefore never made the news. Because sometimes, the most important evidence isn't hidden. It's withheld. There are facts that don't make headlines, not because they're unimportant, but because they're inconvenient. By the time this case faded from the nightly news, a second investigation had quietly begun. Not an official one, a whispered one, built from fragments, off-record conversations, and statements never meant to survive daylight. This is that version. Multiple sources later confirmed the same thing, independently. There was an internal file, not logged into the main evidence system, not shared with prosecutors, and never acknowledged publicly. It contained material deemed too speculative to pursue. But speculation doesn't usually get its own folder. According to one person who claimed to have seen it, the file included a timeline that directly contradicted the official sequence of events, statements from witnesses whose accounts were never recorded on camera, and one note handwritten in the margin that read simply, "This changes everything." The file was removed during a routine audit. No receipt, no digital trace, no explanation. When asked about it years later, a supervisor responded with a single sentence: "If it wasn't logged, it wasn't real." That answer satisfied no one. One witness came forward early. Too early. They didn't match the narrative investigators were forming, but they didn't contradict it either. They added something else, something new. According to two separate accounts, the interview ended abruptly. The recording stopped mid-sentence. The witness was thanked, escorted out, and never contacted again. What they said next was never documented. But years later, speaking anonymously, that same witness described the moment like this: "They weren't surprised, they were alarmed. They had recognized the implication immediately. And implications are dangerous. Not confessions. Worse. Shrugs. Pauses. Carefully chosen words spoken when microphones were off." A retired official later admitted to a journalist. We knew early on that the case wouldn't survive scrutiny. Another said, once the wrong assumption became public, correcting it would have caused more damage than letting it stand. And one statement, never printed, only recounted, still haunts everyone who heard it. Justice wasn't lost, it was negotiated. No names were given. No documents produced. But the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't incompetence anymore. This was containment. There is one fact that was briefly mentioned, once, and then vanished entirely from reporting. It didn't fit any theory. Not the obvious suspect. Not randomness. Not institutional failure alone. It suggested prior knowledge. Preparation. Timing that was too precise to be accidental. When a reporter asked about it at a press conference, the question was deflected. When they asked again later, their access was reduced. By the third attempt, they were reassigned. The detail never appeared again. And anyone who brings it up now is told the same thing. That's been debunked. No one can say how. Because solving the case would have required reopening others. Because acknowledging mistakes would have exposed patterns. Because truth in this situation wasn't just embarrassing. It was destabilizing. So the public was given a simplified version. A version that could be digested, archived, and forgotten. And most people accepted it. Until now. Not who did this, but who decided what we were allowed to know. Because when evidence is suppressed, interviews are truncated and files quietly disappear, the crime doesn't end. It mutates. In the next part, we'll look at the moment everything could have changed, the single mistake that turned a solvable case into a permanent mystery. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every cold case has a moment like this. Not the crime itself, not the discovery, but a decision, made quickly, quietly, and with absolute confidence, that locks the truth out forever. In this case, that moment came less than 48 hours in. At the start, the case was alive. Leads were fresh. Memories unfiltered. Evidence uncontaminated by narrative. Investigators had something rare, time before the story hardened. And then the call came in. Not from the public. Not from a witness. From inside. A senior official reviewed the early findings and flagged one lead as problematic. Not because it was weak, but because it complicated everything else. This lead pointed in the wrong direction. Not away from a suspect. Away from the framework. It suggested the crime didn't happen the way they were already beginning to describe it, that the sequence was wrong, that the assumptions forming in real time were premature. Following it would have meant slowing down, revising statements, correcting early briefings, admitting uncertainty. Instead, the decision was made to set it aside. Not dismiss it. Not debunk it. Just pause it. The language used was bureaucratic and harmless sounding. We'll circle back. They never did. Here, where the damage turned permanent. Hours later, an official statement was released to the public. It included a timeline. That timeline was wrong. But once it was spoken out loud, once it was printed, shared, and repeated, it became truth by repetition. From that moment on, every new piece of evidence was judged not on accuracy, but on whether it fit. Witnesses whose memories conflicted were told they were mistaken. Tips that challenged it were deprioritized. Documents that contradicted it were quietly reworded. The investigation didn't follow the evidence anymore. The evidence followed the narrative. Because correcting it would have meant admitting the mistake. And admitting the mistake would have meant retracting public statements, reopening interviews already closed, acknowledging that the case, may have been misrepresented from the start. One former official later put it bluntly. By the time we realized it mattered, it was too expensive to undo. Not financially, institutionally. That paused lead. It expired. Witnesses moved. Memories faded. One crucial detail, described as time-sensitive, could no longer be verified. When someone finally suggested reopening it years later, the response was immediate. There's nothing left to pursue. That wasn't true. There was plenty left. But it no longer fit the story. This case wasn't doomed by malice. It was doomed by confidence, by the belief that clarity was better than accuracy. That decisiveness mattered more than doubt. And once that choice was made, every step after it was just preservation of a mistake. In the final part, we'll wind this story down, not with answers but with what remains, the people still waiting, the silence that followed, and why this case refuses to stay buried. Because some stories don't end. They linger. In the years since, nothing officially changed. No new charges. No reopened files. No late-night press conference admitting what went wrong. Just time. Time passed the way it always does, unevenly. For the world, the case became a headline from another year. For the people closest to it, it never moved at all. They're still waiting in the same moment. When an investigation ends without answers, something else begins. Silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of avoidance. Emails stop being returned. Requests are acknowledged, then forgotten. Names that once appeared in reports vanish from public record. And the story settles into its final, unofficial state. Unresolved. Not because the truth is unknowable, but because it became inconvenient to pursue. A decision that couldn't be undone. Evidence that no longer speaks. And questions that never stopped making sense. Every theory collapses somewhere. Every explanation leaves something out. And the longer you sit with it, the harder it is to believe this case was meant to be solved the way it was handled. Not because of what we know, but because of what we were never allowed to hear. Cases like this don't just fade. They teach. They show how quickly truth can be shaped. How easily certainty replaces curiosity. How silence becomes policy. And how one decision, made early, made confidently, can outlive everyone involved. If you're still here, it's because something about this story didn't sit right with you either. That's not an accident. This channel exists for cases like this, the ones that were wrapped up too neatly, explained too quickly, or quietly set aside. If you want more stories that dig into what's missing, what was withheld, and what never made the news, stay. Subscribe. And if this case bothered you, there's another one waiting, on screen now, that raises the same questions and leaves even fewer answers. Because the most unsettling stories aren't the ones with twists. They're the ones that end in silence.